Am I glad I did it? I'm very proud of the film. I've been making docs for 25 years. It's probably my favorite project, and for sure it was the most difficult and spouse testing of my projects.
I don't want to ask how much the budget was, but I do want to.
You know, the film itself, we probably raised about $500,000 to make it happen. In terms of how it's doing, we've had extraordinary, wonderful, warm receptions from Jewish film festivals around the country. On the one hand, the film that I'm probably most proud of, and it's also the film that has yet to have any success, and mainstream success is the term I should be using. Part of it has to do with October 7th. You know, I think there's less of an appetite for Jewish content. The inconclusive nature of the ending, you know, makes it a harder sell. For those of you who, you know, spend time on, you know, Netflix or Amazon, you know, the documentaries there now kind of fall into the category of, they're either about, you know, Martha Stewart, you know, or Elton John, or some celebrity, or they're about a really horrible, gruesome true crime in South Carolina. And, you know, this is neither. So there's less of an appetite for the kinds of sophisticated films that audiences like you can appreciate. We had an incredible attorney giving us advice from the very beginning. And our incredible attorney said, you guys are gonna go in and do this, and believe it or not, you're protected. You're not breaking the law at all, doing what you're doing. And not only that, but because he's such a fantastic attorney, so when you shoot in a location, you are supposed to get what's called a location release. You know, whoever owns the property needs to sign it and, you know, give you permission, or else you can get sued. So we had a location release for this building that looks like a standard location release in, you know, translated into Polish. However, our attorney also injected language from a standard tenant farming release, so that there's literally embedded in this whole thing a clause here or there that says if we were to ever dig anything up out of the ground, we would be entitled to keep it rather than the owners of the property. So he was really savvy. Well, anyway, we go do this thing, and then at some point, you know, down when everything kind of like hits the fan, the attorney, the prosecutor in this town says, okay, it turns out you guys didn't break the law, but you guys were doing work in a historical preservation overlay zone. And so, like, you know, that exists in the United States. So you want to, like, paint your shutters green, you have to get permission from the board, or you're well, so we were in violation of the historical preservation overlay zone, and actually, we were potentially liable for 8 years in prison because of that. And what we heard from our attorneys, when we finally got an invitation to premiere, our initial screens were in Palm Springs, the attorneys started panicking. And they said, you know, not only you and Gary and Dylan could potentially be prosecuted, but every single person on your team could be prosecuted. Not just prosecuted like you can't go back to Poland, but Poland's an EU country, so you can't go to Italy. You know, you could land at the airport in Italy and you know, there'd be a warrant for your arrest. And so one of our less talented attorneys was like, my advice is that before the premiere, you recut the film, and what you want to do is just remove anything that refers to or shows digging, and you'll be okay. And so anyway, but the super long story, now coming to a conclusion, is that I think sort of big picture wise, you know, you have to ask yourself, why did we behave the way we did? And for that matter, why did the people in Poland react the way they did to us in different circumstances? And I think a lot of it relates to ignorance and fear, you know, and misjudging people's motivations. And so our sense, basically our attorneys ultimately were able to speak to the prosecutor in Poland, and the prosecutor agreed to, quote, suspend the investigation. So it's not definitively over, but it is suspended. And I think the reason that happened is because the prosecutor basically heard about us and assumed that we were doing the kinds of horrible things that people in the building thought we might have been doing. And when our attorney was able to explain that actually, no, we were there we weren't trying to profit. In fact, we were there succeeding and losing lots of money, but that we weren't trying to profit, we were just trying to do something that was honorable. She realized, all right, I don't need to prosecute these guys for painting their shutters green. It's, this is all a big, crazy misunderstanding, and we'll suspend, so at this point we seem to be okay, and hopefully it will stay that way.
Right. The question is, if they had told the truth from the beginning, would there have been a different outcome?
Okay, so as I've already demonstrated, I do very roundabout, long-winded answers, but here's the roundabout answer to that question. So I know there are people in this audience who have done work in the entertainment industry, and in fact, there's kind of a truism when you are writing a film and when you're telling a story, that oftentimes the film is most successful if there is a main character who has some sort of obstacle that they're trying to surmount, and the challenges of surmounting that obstacle are extraordinary. And really what it's about, what the film is ultimately about, is this individual's journey, and that at the end of the film they have been changed by their journey. They've gone through these travails and they've come out and they're different, and that's kind of the satisfying reality of so much of storytelling that you can think about, films that you love. And so documentary storytelling, you're dealing with real life rather than writing a script, but you try to frame it in ways that engage an audience, that use the tropes of fiction storytelling. And so for us, our main character, Gary, we spent a long time in the edit room searching for ways to show that somehow he had transformed or been changed by this experience. And what we found is that Gary is exactly the exact same way, unchanged, unbent, he's just I would do it exactly the same way, and I was totally right, and now with that said, personally, my sense is that horrible things would have happened if we told the truth from the outset. Not that we would not have succeeded in pursuing this, because there would have been the same sorts of dishonesty, and there's all sorts of elements in Poland that would not have been working, in the right direction. But I also think that there wouldn't have been a film, it's funny when you think about another truism of storytelling is that conflict is what makes stories oftentimes compelling. People, butting heads with each other, or things going wrong. If you think about reality shows, they're constantly ginning up conflict, because that's what people want to watch. And so, as a sort of comrade of Gary's on this whole experience, every time something went wrong, it was heartbreaking to me. And as a filmmaker, every time something went wrong, I was thinking, this would be a nice thing that happens. But yeah, I suspect we would not have succeeded if we told the truth, but we certainly didn't succeed by not telling the truth.
Yeah. Here, Deb.
Yeah, hi. I really love the film. I think I'm going to have really weird dreams about Lucky Jews. That was so strange. My question is, have you shown, or have you contemplated showing the film in Poland? What do you think would happen if you haven't already?
First of all, I should say, as part of, for those of you who've ever done a Kickstarter campaign, you know that when you give money to a campaign, you're oftentimes promised some sort of reward based on however much money you give. And oftentimes that'll be, people will come up with really creative gifts and T-shirts and fun, kitchen magnets and all that sort of thing. And for a film about the Holocaust, it felt very strange to try to come up with a celebratory Holocaust T-shirt. But when we were trying to come up with premiums that we could give to people who contributed, one of the ideas we had was that we would give them Lucky Jews. And in fact, that's, I ended up getting a shipment of 150 Lucky Jews that have now been dispersed around the United States and the world. We did not get into a couple of the Polish festivals that we've submitted to. We expect we will ultimately be seen in Poland. we're actually going to be screening in Berlin. We have 4 screenings in May scheduled, and it seems like we may be screening in Geneva at some point soon. Absolutely, there's a whole world of people in Poland who aren't particularly keen on this subject matter. At the same time, there's a whole world of people like Sylvia, who we were so fortunate to meet, and she's become a dear friend of ours. And when we premiered in Palm Springs, she and her daughter flew to Los Angeles, and all her daughter wanted to do was visit Universal Studios, and it was the day that the fires hit, and they closed down Universal Studios. But she's such a lovely human being, and but we encountered a lot of people like that, many of whom are obviously not in the film, but I think that there is a lot to be hoped for, especially among younger people in Poland, and hopefully things will continue to evolve in the right direction.
Before you started on this project, your own connection to Judaism, your own connection to the Holocaust, were you looking at this as a Jewish film, as a Holocaust film, or was this just something that you walked into?
There are so many things I would say about that. I will restrain myself, but I would say I'm a terrible Jew. I did not have a bar mitzvah. I have tried at various points in my life to sort of make myself part of a community, and I don't feel much of an affinity for the religious aspects of Judaism. At the same time, I feel an incredible affinity for the cultural reality of being Jewish. And as far as this being about the Holocaust, absolutely, without a millet doubt, this was, it felt like the kind of thing, it sounds really naive, I suppose, but we were very sincere in the hope and belief that, gosh, maybe there'd be some guy in Birmingham, England, or his children who would open up the door and we would hand the stamp over and say, this belongs to your family. That was a thrilling prospect. And, I think that so much of what goes on right now, it's so confusing, the anti-Semitism that is starting to grow in this country, and the ignorance. And so I think there was something very powerful, at least in my mind, that there might be this physical artifact that would prove a story and would be this legacy, this piece of probably a box of sludge if we were ever to find it, but who knows, that somehow we could use as a way. Ultimately, this whole film is an attempt to, there's so much that has been done about the Holocaust, and the only people who go see films about the Holocaust, for the most part, are people who care about the Holocaust. So what we were consciously trying to do with this was create a whole bunch of spoons full of sugar, so a little bit of the medicine of information might, engage people who wouldn't otherwise turn out to see a Holocaust film. And so our mission absolutely was to try to make history interesting and accessible to people who haven't, engaged with it, even in this day.
Which we hope to play in next year's Jewish Film Festival. So Gita, we bless you.
So we don't have absolute clarity about what's happened in that basement, but we do know that there are certain storage rooms that the residents searched. We also know for a fact that there are certain storage rooms that were not searched. Partly because there were cranky residents who were like, I'm not letting you in my storage room. And essentially, there's one very specific storage room that I would love to get back into, and it's my understanding that that storage room has never been searched. We had originally cut this as a 3.5-hour series, so there's a lot that did not make it into the film. This is just between us, but Pavel is the name of the guy. Mr. X is not Pavel, but Pavel was one of the residents who was the ringleader, and he'd always seemed like such a nice guy and so enthusiastic. And when we heard that Pavel was leading this, effort to dig things up on their own, I was like, who is this guy? And I typed his name into Facebook, and his Facebook profile is public, and people on Facebook sort of list the things that they're especially passionate about. And the thing that he loves most of all is metal detecting. And he loves searching for treasure. And which is, by the way, a big pastime in Poland. Without a doubt, they've searched certain areas, and my absolute understanding is they still have not searched certain areas. The odds were so stacked against us from the outset, so I think if we're talking about odds, the odds are extraordinarily good that in April or May of 1945, this box was dug up by raping and pillaging and marauding Soviet troops making their way west to Berlin, and the stamps disappeared, eons ago. But for sure, it still may be there.
How do you research all the people that they were connected to those Gestapo men, and how do you go to the family and to those older ladies? They seem happy to contribute with information, but did they express any remorse or any sorry to you guys?
Mimi was the woman who was very present, when we met her father and aunt, and then Karen, I never met in person, but spoke to over the phone. They both live in Florida. Mimi lives in St. Augustine, Florida, and she arranged for a screening of a film at the St. Augustine Film Festival. And Karen lives in Key West and is trying to drum up a screening, and they're both ecstatic. And the funny thing about the film is that when we approached them, we really, we were sort of very delicately, how do we not alienate them? How do we make them not afraid of our motivation? And at the end of the film, we have created this story about these people whose, great uncle was a war criminal, and whose grandfather was a pretty shitty, dishonest Nazi. And so this is true of any doc that you do. You're always afraid of how your subjects are going to react. And I remember getting on the phone with Karen afterwards, and what is she gonna say? And what she said was, I love the film. The photos that you picked of me, my hair looks amazing. And you said I was hilarious, which I love, And, with all that, in terms of them, quote, apologizing to us, or to anybody for that matter, listen, they're as American as anybody in this room. You would never, they have no, as they said, they barely knew their grandfather. And actually, I would lump Karen and Mimi in with Sylvia. We absolutely came up against people who were incredibly difficult to work with, and as is true of any project I've ever done, you also meet people who just turn out to be extraordinary, and we were so fortunate that they ended up being so kind and helpful and receptive to us. And what a strange serendipity that we ended up getting footage of Adolf Ballman, the war criminal, that there's actually newsreel footage of him. And if you look at the newsreel footage, he's being brought in by these American, investigators, and he is looming over them. He's 6'9". He's a huge guy, and he's got the scar on his face, and he looks really scary. And when I eventually met his nephew, Jens, in Delaware, Jens is about 6'6", and has kind of a similar facial structure. And after we met with them, we all went out and had this really lovely lunch together. And I remember sitting across the table from Jens and realizing, this is a guy who has the same DNA as his uncle, and he is huge, and he has that same face, but he basically moved to the United States in 1954 and ended up working throughout his career, throughout his life at a Volkswagen dealership. And it's just kind of like a roly-poly, kind of like German-American guy who's really lovely. And just the sort of, sliding door reality of one person's life was, growing up in Berlin and, being exposed to Nazism, and then his nephew winds up, becoming a New York Giants fan and, being a really sweet guy. And then raising these incredibly lovely daughters who just could not have been nicer, one of whom dates Jewish guys. And by the way, both of them, I think one of them is 6'1", one's 6'2". So, yeah.
Thank you for your film, that was wonderful. I'm wondering, I know that the Polish politics has changed over the 10 years, and so they went from a conservative government to a liberal government. Now, is there any discussion that you're aware of to do any kind of repatriation or restoring of, I mean, because all over Poland, not just in that area, but all over Poland, things were confiscated, obviously, and you know, as you mentioned in the film, it's the only nation that never compensated Jews for stolen property.
I think if one tries to have empathy for the Polish people, they are geographically screwed. They are wedged between Russia, the former Soviet Union, and Germany. And I remember having this, the first time that we went to this town, we flew into Berlin, and we crossed the border into Poland, and it suddenly felt like we were in Nebraska. The area that we were driving through was flat, just flat. And you realize, I mean, they're in between these two rapacious countries, and their tanks are just gonna like careen through this bowling alley of a landscape and conquer them whenever they feel like it. The Poles have been treated horribly. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think there are all sorts of horrible reasons why they don't acknowledge aspects of their past, or at least some people in the society don't. And then there are also completely understandable reasons. I mean, Poland itself was destroyed, it has been repeatedly destroyed and plundered. And so they very much feel like, it's what the woman said at one point in the film, it's like, if anybody is owed compensation, it's them. They had all sorts of things taken from them. With that said, obviously, I mean, there are degrees of suffering. Essentially, the people who got into power and will probably wind up back in power, because in the seesaw, they're the Law and Justice Party, very conservative. We interviewed a guy who is to the far right of the Law and Justice Party, and it's funny. He's part of this party called the Confederatia, and that is literally based on, they model themselves on the American Confederacy, and in fact, the Confederate flag is one of their symbols. And the guy we interviewed is the Polish AOC, if AOC were a right-wing Pole. He's handsome and articulate and very winning, and completely, all he wants is to create a Christian nation and to keep immigrants out, and he's, gaining in popularity in the country. And so I think there's just so many parallels, obviously, not just in Poland, but in the United States and in many other countries, in today's world. So his grandson is interested in filmmaking. What video editing system do we use? What cameras do we use? And what advice? The video editing system we used is Adobe Premiere. The cameras that we used ranged over the many years that we shot the film. You are saying to yourself, wait a minute, he's the director of the film. He doesn't know what cameras they use. How could that be? The answer is because I'm an old person and I don't know how to use technology. And also my eyesight is failing and I shoot things and it looks out of focus. So I have come from an old model of filmmaking where you work with crews. And that leads to the next answer, which is, what is filmmaking about? What advice? And the fact is don't be like me. That at this point, if you want to make things, you have to be doing all the things yourself. You have to rely, one of the most rewarding realities of working on a film is working with a crew of incredibly talented people. And yet, the reality of filmmaking is that nowadays, there's much less money and there's so much content that you have to be able to do all the things on your own. And also, you have to be able to make a living doing other things mostly, because it is increasingly more difficult, and it will become increasingly more and more difficult with media consolidation and all the things that I was talking about before, to make a living in this industry. So it is something that if you're passionate about, you ought to be pursuing, but don't put all your chips on that table, all your eggs in that basket. You get my point. Yeah.
Are they suggesting that the stamps came from only one person, and therefore they would know who they came from? Because I felt like, everybody's suitcases were, and they were a collection. And so that was mine.
It's our understanding that the stamps actually came from multiple collections. It's our understanding that there are auction records, that if whoever took them, and actually I should add, I mean, as naive as our whole endeavor was, we really did hope and imagine that it might come to fruition. So Gary, one of the reasons that he learned about the story is because he used to be a stamp collector. And Gary, in his stamp collecting lifetime, became friends with one of the greatest stamp dealers in the world, who actually has offices in Los Angeles. And so this incredibly quirky guy who smoked a pipe and like leaned back in his chair when we interviewed him, and you were sort of looking at his chin as he was talking to you. He didn't make it in the film, but he's incredibly, like, he's extraordinarily knowledgeable, and he was actually going to be in London he was in London during the time that we did our dig, and we actually had this grand plan that if we dug up this box, we were going to get that box to London and in his presence open it up and see what it had. And you know, I should also add, by the way, I spent months going through the archives of the Shoah Foundation, which is Steven Spielberg. I mean, I had heard of the foundation, I didn't realize what it was until actually diving into it, but essentially when Schindler's List was created, Steven Spielberg funded people to go around the world and interview Holocaust survivors, and not just sit down and interview them, but spend 5, 6, 10, 12 hours on camera getting their in-depth stories. And so there is an archive of more than 50,000 interviews with Holocaust survivors, unbelievably detailed. They had people speaking languages around the globe, interviewing in every language, anybody they could find. And I was looking for stories of people who had their stamp collections stolen. And in fact, we had a screening in Naples, Florida a week ago, and somebody came up afterwards and told me that, their father had lost, his stamp collection. They'd always fantasized about getting it back. I mean, how many of these stamp collections have incredibly valuable stamps? Probably very few of them, but, clearly Rudolph felt that there was value to whatever it was that he was getting his hands on.
Interplay between documentary and narrative storytelling. And I was struck, a lot of the humor and the freshness of the film comes from these little quirky moments of humor and people interacting with each other. And I can imagine that you captured a whole bunch of stuff and then you picked the parts to make a story. But I could also imagine you said, wouldn't it be good if this happened and that happened, and you're sort of nudging the people toward, let's have a scene where we do this and a scene where we do that. I'm curious,
Right.
and all of which is fine, but how do you interplay?
So I actually teach filmmaking and talk a lot about what makes a documentary ethical, what makes a documentary trustworthy, and the answer is it's hard to say. For those of you who've seen, there's a movie called Super Size Me, which is basically a guy who says, I'm going to eat McDonald's for 30 days and film myself and see what happens to me, and make a film about nutrition and fast food. And I give that as an example because I think it's a fantastic documentary. But if you think about what it is, it's a reality show. The premise is a reality show. It's this very sort of artificial situation in which he's decided to create the situation and chronicle himself doing it. Sometimes you have to lie to tell the truth. And I think documentaries, by definition, are lies. What you're doing is taking the messiness of real life and trying to shape it and make sense of it and create a narrative that audiences can engage with. And sort of order reality in such a way that it suddenly tells you a story that makes you think. And so, by definition, everything that you film, when you point your camera at something, the thing that's outside the frame, you've chosen not to show it. When every time you make a cut, there's a temporal cut. Absolutely, there are things in this film where we realize, we did this and then we did that, but if you show that before this, it makes this way more interesting, And so you have to ask yourself constantly, at what point am I deceiving the audience, and at what point am I simply helping the audience perceive truth? I will give one quick example. So I did a film years and years and years ago about the World Trade Center. And we had interviews with all these New York City first responders. The interviews happened within months of 9/11, and the film is about a couple of very heroic police. It was a police officer and a fireman. They were both brothers. They both died, and there were these like tough guy New York City cops who were weeping in these interviews. Very, very powerful, emotional things. And there's this one interview where this guy, this tough guy, is like weeping, and he says something like, you know, I can't believe that there are 4,000 New Yorkers who died in there. I can't believe that there's 37 New York City police officers, and I can't believe they're 5 of my best friends. Really powerful statement. So we get back in the edit room, and within a couple months they rejigger the numbers, and they determine that actually it's close to about 3,000 people who died in the World Trade Center, not 4,000. So we have an interview that's incredibly emotionally powerful, in which a guy gives a wrong piece of information. And we had a lot of discussion and debate. What do we do in this moment? Like, do we go out and interview this guy again? Because he's not gonna cry. It's not gonna be nearly as emotionally powerful. Do we have like a subtitle beneath it to clarify? Like, how do we handle this? And after much discussion, the way we handled it is we found a moment in his interview where he said the word 3, and we sliced out the 4 and we put the 3, and he now says that when you watch the film, 3,000 people, even though that's not what he said. Is that honest? Is that real? Is that truth? I mean, that's the kind of thing. It's actually one of the, like, that sort of conundrum is very much one of the many reasons why I love making films, because it's so challenging and you never know what you're going to encounter. And it's a constant process of trying to figure out how to be as respectful as you possibly can to your subjects and to your audience, while deceiving them with kindness to try to tell the story as effectively as possible. Yeah.
Go ahead, Barry, speak up.
I saw the movie Among Neighbors. Have you ever interacted with Holocaust? Were you making it at the same time? Were you ever comparing notes on what's going on in Poland?
Okay, so Barry's asking about a film that's also on the circuit right now called Among Neighbors. And I actually, Yoav, the filmmaker, I met him and we actually went and had coffee recently because has had a very similar experience to mine. And for those who haven't seen it, it's an incredible film, basically sort of telling the story of 2 people who knew one another in the war, and then kind of, because of the way the Holocaust worked, lost track of each other. And it's a mystery story. It's hard to explain, but it's really powerful. And it's specifically about an ugly secret about a town in Poland. So there's a sequence in our film where we talk about how if you go onto YouTube, you're gonna see all these really worrying things that are going on in Poland. And I remember, there's a cowshed, that was built from Jewish tombstones. And then I remember like finding this thing where there's this debate, where for some political debate where like some guy uses a yarmulke to like show that his opponent is compromised, that is sympathetic to Jews. So it's just, and then I remember seeing Yoav's film, and he had found somebody, or like images of people who had taken the tops of Jewish graves that are round and had continued cutting through them to make them completely round, and then punched holes in them, and they were using them as knife sharpeners, And I remember seeing his film and thinking, like, feeling some degree of envy, like, wow, that was an incredible find, But yeah, absolutely, there were people we interviewed that, there was a lot of overlap. And that is ultimately the challenge, is how do you create something? There's so much content, but how much of that content is ultimately landing and being seen by people and affecting people? And I think we're both facing the challenge of how do you get the film out into the world as effectively as possible. And with that, I'm going to say thank you guys very much. I really appreciate you coming out. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for making the film. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for coming.